Go ahead, John.
Can you hear me? All set?
All set?
Yes.
You can.
Yeah. I don't see I just see an R for you, Waluka.
I am off screen. I went off screen, so you're just
Okay.
going to see
All
the
right. Well, let's
ambassador.
see. Anyways, good afternoon. It's John Florescu. I'm here in Bucharest, Romania, and today I'm re-welcoming Ambassador Ursu, who I had the pleasure of interviewing live on the stage. You'll remember that a couple of years ago in Washington. And I'm glad to see you've survived Washington for 2 years, Mr. Ambassador. And thank you for coming back. I was looking for video of you recently in Chisinau, but I'm sure you were there with the Tony Blinken visit. Is that so?
No, unfortunately, I'm just back in Mexico. I'm also an ambassador to Mexico. It was just a coincidence.
Oh, I see.
But yes, we did welcome Secretary of State Blinken to Chisinau for the second time since the Russian war against Ukraine started. So we are very pleased to welcome him.
Well, that's fantastic. I think your president said it was an excellent relationship between the United States. So some credit goes to you for sure for assuring that. And he talked about many different aspects of the relationship and what was going on. He referred to bullying from Russia, misinformation, and all that kind of all aspect, which we're certainly familiar with, cyber attacks. I mean, if you're sitting in Moldova today, how do they see this war? I know you must go back and forth, and certainly you must be talking to a lot of people, but this is a moving target. How do they see it today, now at the beginning of June?
If you're asking me, John, if I'm worried or not about the developments on the ground, I would say I'm not worried. I don't look anxious. I continue to believe in the strength of Ukrainian fighters, but also the resilience of Ukrainian citizens. Just because they are defending their own country, while Russian soldiers are driven either by greed of new territories or blinded by the lies of an authoritarian regime's propaganda. I think the level of insecurity and anxiety among the Moldovan population, but also of the government, is way, way lower than 2 years ago. And this is referring to Blinken's visit to Chisinau. He visited first the Secretary of State in March 2022, so just in the first few weeks after the attacks. And I can say certainly that the level of anxiety at that moment among the population, where we were also receiving a huge inflow of Ukrainian refugees, but also worried about the front line, which was moving quite fast, if you remember.
Yeah,
it's a very different situation these days. I think we still are watching the front line every morning. That's my first news feed I'm opening. But at the same time, we are confident that there is no imminent threat to Moldovan territory.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, I think however, we want to be very frank and honest to our people, and the government adopted together with Parliament last December the new national security strategy. And for the first time in this document, we say clearly that Russia is the existential threat, the number one threat to our national security, the threat for our democracy, the threat for our prosperity. We also acknowledge Russians' intentions, as we've seen in the first weeks of the war against Ukraine, that the intention was to build a land corridor on the Black Sea, and which would means that there was a chance, a much higher chance at the beginning of the war, to have Russian troops on our border. We still have Russian troops on our territory, just to remind you. On the eastern side of our territory, the Transnistrian region. And though Russia has committed to withdraw it's true. By 2002, it still hasn't complied with that commitment.
I see. Those are about 40 kilometers, I think, from the capital, Transnistria, right?
Between Chisinau and Tiraspol is about 30 miles, so it's very close. But people, we don't have an internal border in the sense that the Moldovan government doesn't impose a control on people's flow, so people continue to travel to one place, go shopping, meet, have jobs. In this sense, people-to-people contact continued over the 30 years of what it seems a frozen conflict.
I see. You know, the interesting thing, I've been to Chisinau a few times. I was there when John Kerry was there a while back. And I remember arriving one day on what's called Language Day. And I was just walking around and I'd say, what's the language? And people would kind of hesitate, you know, they'd sort of kind of dodge the question. So I always wondered in my head, why the hesitancy? Do some people feel more Russian or some people feel more Romanian? And could you explain that perplexing face I get near the square when I ask that question?
Certainly. How long is this interview? How many days? Just to explain this.
Oh, okay. Give me the short.
It's a complex question of national identity. And I think the short version is Moldova is a very young country. It's 33 years old. So if you would excuse, it's still working on defining its national identity. I know countries who are much older, 200 years old, like Belgium, and they're still working on that definition. So excuse the confusion of some of the people when it says language is part of that national identity question. I can give you the legal answer. And when we drafted the Constitution at that time, 94, the parliamentarians decided to enshrine the official name of the language would be Moldovan with Latin alphabet, which basically means Romanian language, because that was the only distinguish between Romanian and Moldovan language. However, this legal aberration was solved last year, I believe, by Constitutional Court that acknowledged, because of the Declaration of Independence of Moldova, the language is called Romanian. There is no differences between the two languages. But as this Constitutional Court amended the Constitution to now call the official language of Moldova Romanian. Again, it doesn't mean that people don't continue calling it Moldovan, but in schools, we all study Romanian language, and there is no difference. So I think it's a matter of, even in my family, it's a generation question. So my grandparents who were born in Romania before the Second World War started, before Stalin annexed what is now Republic of Moldova, they went to Romanian school, so they were speaking Romanians, they were reading the Bible in Romanian, they never spoke Russian or knew Cyrillic alphabet. My parents, as a different generation, went to Soviet schools, they learned only Cyrillic, so they probably continue to call it Moldovan. And then those like me and younger generation that went to study under the new curriculum, under the Latin alphabet and Romanian, would call it Romanian. So it really depends. It's a generational, but it's part of a much bigger, complex question of national identity.
Yeah, well, it was something that just struck me when I was over there. And for that matter, I mean, even here in Romania, where you don't have a lot of pro-Russian feeling, you still find politicians and people in Romania that are pro-Russian and pro-Putin, like the Gold Party here, that have sort of waves and a whiff of that feeling, and are not particularly, they're not particularly mute about it. You see that kind of thing. But I would say that, generally speaking, you could understand the apprehension given being so close, and as you say, so close to the remains of the 14th Army. What kind of help did Moldova get from the United States? Because Secretary Blinken mentioned a bunch of things in terms of the anti-cyber help in a university and help in agriculture. What kind of help did your country get from the United States, and in which way it was most helpful, most significant?
Certainly, I think and again, I need to acknowledge that besides the military operations and war in Ukraine, which create those headlines and visuals of people suffering and being killed, Russia is also conducting hybrid wars against many other countries, especially in Eastern Europe, but also beyond Eastern Europe and in other places. And Moldova has been a testing ground for Russia, an easy target for those hybrid attacks. And indeed, if we do take those threats to our national security quite seriously, and it's something we are addressing. And just to give you a few examples, indeed, disinformation propaganda is a classic tool in the hybrid war toolbox. And because Moldovans majorities still speak or understand Russian, this is a fertile ground for Russian disinformation, either through media, through TV, social media particularly, to incite that anti-Ukrainian sentiments, to justify the war, which cannot be justified under international rules, but also anti-NATO and anti-EU in general. And this is particularly has been intensifying as we are preparing for a constitutional referendum in October to enshrine in our constitution the vision and the choice of Moldova becoming member of the European Union. Another hybrid attack is the interference into election process. Again, we are, as many countries in the world, including the US, will be holding important elections, again in October, presidential elections. And we see a lot of cash being spent by Russia to fund illegally, under the Moldovan rules, of political actors, political parties, literally luggages of cash being brought into Moldova, and also then used for even direct vote buying. You know, we have many criminal cases already in the courts about buying votes. What was the last local elections in Gagauzia, where because of the inflation, the vote cost, increased from $20 now to 50 euros. Another area kind of attacks is the cyber attacks. I think we're all facing this, and Moldova, with very little investment, I would say. I don't think I reveal any secrets into the cybersecurity, has been an easy victim for those kind of attacks. And again, this is nothing new, but they are important and critical for our national security. So what does it mean? I think Moldova in general has shown strong resilience to these attacks. And again, I wouldn't go into details. There was a big scandal last year about the attempts by Russia to train and infiltrate violent elements into the street protests in order to topple down the government. I think by sharing information with our partners, including Europeans, US, we were able to reveal the evidence of the plan. But also now, with the primary support of the European Union, US, we've been really strengthening our cyber capabilities. Again, we had the Deputy Administrator of USAID, Coleman, just visiting a few weeks ago, opening with the support of USAID the cyber core. So this is an educational institution and also meant to strengthen the capacities of our key institution working on cybersecurity. Blinken was here also to announce additional financial support, especially for our energy security. As part of the hybrid war, as you know, Russia has been weaponizing energy supplies, Moldova being 100% dependent on Russian energy sources before the war started, was able, with the support with the US, to build new supply relationships, mostly with the European gas companies. Romania, of course, has been a strong supporter. And one of the projects that was revealed during Blinken's visit is to boost the storage capacity for our electricity production, so we can incorporate more of local produced renewable energy, specifically electricity, as we are looking to boost our local production for electricity. This is just a few examples. Of course, the spectrum of our relationship has been widening, but also deepening in many areas. And just Blinken's visit to Chisinau is a proven evidence that US is paying attention to the needs of Moldova, and I can definitely tell that it's been a strong supporter for strengthening our independence, because if we are talking about energy security, this is about gaining that independence, particularly against Russia, so Russia cannot use our dependencies as a leverage.
Yeah, I see. Well, I mean, it's quite remarkable when you think since John Kerry was there have been at least 3 visits of a U.S. secretary, and I think John Kerry was the first. And the impact has been strengthened, and the range of services on solar panels from USAID and in other areas has been very clear and very strong, which is a big endorsement of your government. It strikes me that there's still an unease in the capital. I was in Chisinau about a month ago, and I was speaking at the university about a historical subject, Queen Marie. And one student stood up and said, can I ask you a question as a Moldavian to an American? What's going to happen in our election, in your election in the United States? How will that affect us? And when he asked the question, everybody went silent in the room. There are about 300 to 400, I think it's Frederick's University, 300 to 400 people. There must be a tremendous, nonetheless, given your proximity and the fact you're not in NATO, but still resilient and strong with a strong government, but there must be still an unease across the country, maybe not like in 22. Could you speak to that?
You know, there is always an unease about elections, but it seems everybody's going through election this year. Yeah. It's not just the US, Europeans, just in a few weeks, you know, I've been in Mexico. We're waiting elections, very important elections this Sunday. And as I said, Moldova will go. I think many of the countries and the voters, both in the US, but in many other places, I actually worry about and pay attention more to internal problems and the solutions that their politicians are bringing to solve some of those problems. And we see that, I mean, the foreign policy issues kind of go on the background. And this is, I think it's normal. It's nothing to expect. And again, I think if we go beyond the headlines and media loves to accentuate the differences of opinion, and rather than focus on the unity of opinions, because this is what it sells, the news, the differences. So I don't think there is an insurmountable argument among either European partners or even US political actors on issues like Ukraine. What I witnessed is a strong unity among the major actors of continuing support for Ukraine, also recognizing Ukraine's rights to defend itself and the need to provide the support to Ukraine. I think if you take, and we saw that in the numbers of support for the last Ukrainian supplemental on the Hill, both on the Senate side, but also in the House. Again, this doesn't sell as news, showing though accentuating those numbers, because the loudest voices in the chamber are the one on the margins, and I think they're still marginal. So I think if I were to read and again, focus on the last events, the last developments, Zelensky tour in Europe last week, this week, even the gathering of foreign ministers in Prague, which is happening on informal meeting of foreign ministers and the statement they're making, Ukraine continuing to sign those bilateral security agreements, providing very strong commitments for long-term support for Ukraine, and also new commitments of military supplies. Just over the last few days, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, those kind of commitments that continue. I'm not worried about that. And we really need to look between the lines, those big headlines, that really the news that really matters.
Yeah.
I think, again, another indicator is on issues that seems to be a taboo just a few months ago or in 2002, like we saw advancements of the debates and even commitments, for instance, the questions of sending training officers, Western training officers to Ukraine. We saw many countries already committed to that, or allowing the use of Western artillery against military targets on Russian territories.
Yes.
Again, those are important advancements.
Has Moldova received any assistance in military assistance, not necessarily military hardware, but secondary sort of assistance from the United States? Has the Moldovan government received that from the U.S.?
We have a strong military defense security cooperations with the US, and it didn't start 2 years ago. It started 30 years ago. We have a very strong cooperation with the National Guard in North Carolina, which is our sister state. And within that agreement, many of our military service people have been trained, got instructions. We conducted for the last 30 years, joint military operations, again, training. And within that cooperation, we've been receiving some of the non-lethal equipment to strengthen the capacity of our military. Over the last few years, again, that kind of a commitment has probably increased. We signed a memorandum of cooperation with the Department of Defense on building the capacities of Moldovan military. We just signed last week a security cooperation memorandum with the European Union. We do have agreements and strong cooperation with NATO, though we are not seeking NATO membership, but we've been an active partner of the NATO's Partnership for Peace program. We're even working now on special new program, individual tailored partnership agreement with NATO. And within those various agreements, we've been receiving trainings, of course, but also some of the military equipment. Just today, we have the German Ministry of Defense visiting Chisinau a few hours ago. You know, they brought also some materials to support our military and a commitment to provide some of those military equipment to boost the capacity of our army. So it's not just the US, but many of our European partners. I think just worth mentioning, as we've been updating our national security strategy, we're also updating, is about to be approved, a new defense strategy. But we know the vision and the aims of that strategy. I think the war was a wake-up call for everybody in Europe, including Moldovan, that we've been underinvesting in our own military capacity. So we've been increasing our own military budget. The aim is to ensure 100% interoperability with NATO forces to the NATO standards. For that, we will slowly be increasing. We have been increasing, but we'll continue increasing our military budget from very low numbers. As I said, just before in 2021, our budget probably was 0.3% of the GDP. We just doubled it to 0.65 just in 2 years, and we're hoping to get to 1% by 2030, and that will continue. And a lot of that increase will go both for preparing our military and also acquiring those military equipments that we would need to ensure interoperability.
I see. I just about 3 weeks ago, I was at the border of Transnistria, and where the 14th Army's been, since 1992, I guess it was, somewhere around then. And I wondered, how many troops do the Russians have in this 14th Army? How big is that force?
Again, it depends how you define what is a Russian force. Formally, it's between 1,300 to 1,500 soldiers. But because they were not able to ensure the rotation of that personnel, the Russian has been distributing for some time already Russian passports to the local populations.
I see.
So they've been recruiting within that rotation local population, and many of them, they do have Russian passports, but they also hold Moldovan passports or Ukrainian passports. So yeah, technically you can call them Russian soldiers, but they also have multiple, I think, loyalties as holders of various other citizens.
Well, I noticed the license plates have different flags on them as well, the license plates of Transnistria. I see that Jim's just popped on the line. I know he's eager to ask a question. Jim Rosapep, who is U.S. Ambassador to Romania and probably knows the situation well. Jim.
Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. Very, very insightful, very, very helpful. I have to confess, I've never been to Moldova. And so I have less knowledge than either of you all do. But one of the questions that has always rattled around my mind is, how do experts like yourself think Russia thinks about Moldova? Because on the one hand, Stalin occupied it. It was part of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, as you point out, the history is it was part of Romania for decades and decades and decades, for a long time. People speak Romanian. Do the Russians see a national security interest in dominating Moldova, or is Moldova more like a vestige of the Soviet Union that kind of is a problem?
Jim, it's very difficult. There is a Russian saying, and I cannot say it in Russian because I don't think people would understand, but it's very difficult to understand what Russians think. You have to only feel it. And that's why it's really important to understand the Russian culture, the Russian history, to get to that point. I don't think it's a rational thinking. And I used to call myself a political analyst on Russia, but I now I'm ashamed because, I was very naive to believe that Russia would never attack Ukraine. It was just extraordinary to what happened. Again, I think if you ask the majority of Russian population, who, like any other nation, is very introvert, they probably wouldn't even, they might know where most Moldova is on the east somewhere, but they wouldn't have a particular attachment or, you know, desire or understanding why Russia would bother even with Moldova, which is far beyond its borders. I don't think the average Russian would even know about Transnistrian conflict and what Russia is doing there. Again, is a big, and I don't think the Russian propaganda has been investing a lot of efforts to explain to its population what is their interest in the Transnistrian region. I think what I'm worried, and again, this is part of the Russian propaganda, is this idea of the bigger Russia, is the colonial expansionist policies. And again, if that's not unusual for, you know, big former empires. You always need to expand. You need enemies in order to disrupt your population from other issues and internal problems. So this is a matter of controlling the population. I think that works very well. In Russia, there are episodes in Russia where they didn't have those enemies or protected the enemies. And then the Russian leaders will have to face the population and the voters to find solutions to the internal problems, and that didn't work very well. So I think they experimented this in the 90s. They realized, you know, Russia is not ready for changing leadership or holding governments to accountable or finding solution to the internal problems by focusing on their own development. So they went back to their traditional model of finding enemies, expansionist policies, because I think that's the way to disrupt the population and to control the population. And again, we talk a lot about the Russian war in Ukraine, but I'm also following very closely what's happening inside Russia, what's happening to dissent in Russia, the disappearance of independent media. Those are, you know, crucial elements as they're part of this expansionist policies, but also to control the population. And I'm afraid Moldova might be just either direct victim or collateral damage to that much bigger expansionist colonial policies of Putin. Again, it's not the whole population, it's the regime. In order to control the population, they need to continue expanding.
Well, picking up that point, Mr. Ambassador, that sense of kind of hemming in this colonial appetites, one could be forgiven to believe that the primary objective of Moldovan foreign policy would be to tie into NATO at this point. And I know that there's a NATO summit or an anniversary coming up, I think in July, 75 years of NATO. Why wouldn't adherence or joining up to NATO not be a top target of the Moldavian government?
The main priority of our foreign policy, but also of our internal transformation, is for Moldova to become member of the European Union.
I see, yeah.
And we really, that's what we really want to focus on. We've been in a crisis management mode for the last 2 years, but we also have a very positive agenda of continuing transformation, the country that would allow us to get closer to the EU. As you know, the EU leaders gathered in Brussels in December and finally acknowledged and offered to open negotiations with the EU, both for Ukraine and Moldova. So we are really working very hard on the homework that we will need to do. And those who knows about the EU enlargement and accession, this is a lot of homework, and it's a really deep transformation. It's not just foreign policies, actually very little foreign policies, very much internal policies of transformation of, you know, from phytosanitary standards of how we produce, how we market our apples and cherries, to internal production, how, you know, every cow, every pig needs to be counted and traced. That's going to take a bit of time. We do hope to break the record, and our ambition is to become member of the EU by 2030. And this is really what we are focusing, and that would require a lot of effort. And thankfully, we do have the opening both from the EU leadership, but also the US. If you look at the US national security strategy, Moldova is mentioned once in a very positive way, that the US will support Moldova together with Ukraine and Georgia on their path of European integration. And a lot of our bilateral relations with the US has been focusing exactly on those issues, how US is helping us to develop, to adjust to those standards, how to market our produce better to the EU market. But also, like, one of the biggest challenge, the biggest reform is the justice reform. This is why it's the first chapter that EU is opening with any candidate countries, and that's something we're really embarking on, supported by the US government. We are doing the integrity test of the entire justice system, from the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, prosecutors, and the US experts are helping us to really go and check every judge and every prosecutor.
Did you ever hear, Mr. Ambassador, to me, which sounded like a far-fetched idea I heard in Chisinau, where there was some talk, given the length of time to get into NATO, of creating some kind of alliance with Romania that would give it a presumption of that the sovereignty or the protective shield of NATO could extend right to the far borders of Moldova? Has that ever been discussed in serious circles? Have you heard that discussion before?
Again, our relationship with NATO is not new. We've been a partner since probably more than 20 years. And we've been enhancing that kind of partnerships through various means, including creating a special programs, NATO program, to support the modernization of our military capacities. However, just to make it clear, Moldova is not seeking NATO membership. Under our constitution, Moldova continues to be a neutral country, which doesn't allow us to join any military alliances, also it means that Moldova could not host any military forces permanently based on its territory. And that specific article was addressed to Russia in order to seek the commitment from Russia to withdraw its military base, which is now in the Transnistrian region. Unfortunately, Russia is the only country that still violates our neutrality clause by refusing to withdraw its military from our territory. This being said, we do have very close cooperation on security, defense, military with European Union member states, including Romania. And Romania has been, as you know, a very close ally to Moldova, has been really helping us to get to that point where Russia wouldn't be able to use the leverages it has had against Moldova, like on energy, trade embargoes, and I believe Romania will definitely continue to support us. Our Minister of Defenses have very close relationship. We do joint exercises, and we do get that support. Most recently, Moldova acquired new air surveillance equipment just because some of the Russian missiles have been flying over Moldovan territory to hit Ukrainian targets, of course. But this is, again, this is an infringement on our neutrality clause, which says that no country can use the territory of a neutral country like Moldova to attack another country. And Russia has been dismissing those cases. So we are building that first surveillance capacity, air surveillance. And again, just because Moldova is such a small country, we might be relying on exchange of information also with our neighbors, Ukraine and Romania, to ensure that we have a better picture of our airspace. And why not potentially develop some joint air defense capacities as well?
Well, that's interesting, the point about neutrality. I wasn't aware that that's the official position. Has that position somehow, given the closer alliance between Russia and China, has that, let's say, the Chinese turned a colder shoulder to Chisinau, or has that affected in international economic terms elsewhere?
Not really. We have diplomatic relations with China. I don't think the Chinese investors have, for some reason, discovered Moldova. We don't have huge Chinese, when I say commercial trade relationships. And they didn't really play a role or take a position on even Moldovan position on Ukrainian war. This constitutional clause, has been enshrined in our constitution when it was drafted in '94. Again, this is not a taboo topic, which means that there are political actors, political parties that do raise the question about what is the best form to secure, to provide security for the Moldovan population. And I think it's an overdue debate about what neutrality really means. Yeah. Russian disinformation has been quite strongly arguing, falsely though, that neutral countries like Moldova are not allowed to have an army, or they shouldn't be investing in their own capabilities. And there are political forces, mostly aligned with Russia, that continue this argument. That Moldova should not be increasing its military budget and invest in their operability. I think that's an argument to have by political actors about what is the best way for any government. And I want to remind, any government has a duty. It's not an option, has a duty to provide security to its population. Yeah. And being a neutral country, it's even more expensive. If you look at the budget of Switzerland or Finland before joining the NATO, you actually, just because you cannot join alliances, you actually have to spend even more on your own security. And I don't think we have that realization among the population, and this is a debate still to have. And that's why I'm saying Russia is really focusing on that misinformation. We do ask this question in opinion polls. So almost every opinion polls is checking people's choices, preferences on issues of foreign policies, like joining the European Union. We have a more or less stable support of 60–65%. However, on NATO, the latest polls show support about 30% of people wanted to join the NATO. Probably a much bigger number are against it. But it's also an increasing number, because just before the Russian war in Ukraine, it was at about 20%. So I think this debate will continue.
In all your activities dealing with the United States, the Biden administration, you'd go to the Hill, you go to the Senate, you go to, I'm sure, the Commerce and all kinds of departments. And and you see in the United States, there's a relative ignorance of the complexity of those issues. You have the Ukrainian, look how long it took to get the $60 billion to get approved in Congress and get going to help Ukraine and maybe to some extent Moldova. How do you simplify, when you go to see congressional staffs and others, how do you simplify your case? How do you boil it down so they can understand it, so they get to the truth of what you're wishing to convey?
I think it's normal for, as I said, for any country, for politicians to focus first and foremost for the needs and concerns of their voters. And like in every country in the US, there are many other concerns and of the voters. So I think that's why, I don't expect the congressmen or, even citizens to focus and pay so much attention to nuances of which seems to them, foreign policy. There are many global tensions and wars happening. So I think it differs from one person to another. That's part of the democracy, and this is also the job of diplomats like me, the ambassadors, to make the case for why it should matter. I think what I see again in the headlines, we see a lot of the voices, these are the loud voices of the isolationists in the US foreign policy. From my experience, these are still very marginal voices. They are loud, probably the loudest, and I think media continues to amplify those voices, and it gives you an impression that this is a dominant voice. I think, that's my learning from any politics, that, go beyond the headlines, really look for, and in my experience, I've been so well welcomed in many offices in the Congress, and I haven't seen huge differences, and I see still a majority, a very huge majority, for continued support for Ukraine. I don't need to make the basic arguments why Ukraine matters. If I were, and I have a much more rare occasion to meet those isolationists. And again, I completely understand their argument. They're founded in historical tradition of it's coming from George Washington letter. However, again, if you look at the history, every time, I think the history showed when US retract from global affairs, and again, the examples, sooner or later is going to hit it much, much harder anyway. And learning from, and I've done a bit of public health policies, and learning from public health policies of disease control, it's always less onerous and critical to prevent a disease spreading rather than treating it later. And again, there are nuances. I think the last debate over the Ukraine supplemental were just, it was clear there is a majority support to continue Ukraine support. Those nuances about the price tag, is it expensive, is it not expensive, how much we should match with the Europeans, or what would be the means and forms, is it grants, loans? These are normal debates that in any democracy should, I'm a strong believer in deliberative democracies, and those are nuances that the representatives should be thinking of the taxpayers' money. And, I wish those decisions and deliberations happen much sooner and quicker, but democracies are never perfect. And my main argument is always, if it's about the price tag, I can definitely say it would be much cheaper to support Ukraine at this level that we've seen, rather than dealing with a much, much wider, bigger Russian expansionist. I think the worst case scenarios is Russia attacking a NATO member where US will have to send its own soldiers. And I believe that, putting at risk any American soldiers or, ever losing any US citizen's life, it's much, much more expensive than helping Ukraine and supplying Ukraine to defend itself.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a huge admiration in the United States for people who have the guts and the courage to stand up to a menace, which certainly has been the case with Moldova. In some ways, you could say it's the most vulnerable country since it's so close and it's small and so forth. But the courage, I think, that the Moldavians and your president have demonstrated, capture people's admiration in a very significant way. Before we wrap up, I'm going to turn to Jim again in case he has another question, or Raluca, if you have a question from the audience. Jim, do you have any other thoughts?
Oh, let's see. Does Raluca have anything from other folks?
Raluca?
No questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay. I would, let me then, and Jim, did you have anything else on your plate?
Yeah, let me ask this question. Everyone wants to know, where is this going? And I'm just curious because you have a very different perspective coming from Moldova. Where do you think that the war in Ukraine is going?
That's a $1 billion or several $billion question. I'm an optimist. So I'll go back from where I started. I do believe, and I really admire the courage of Ukrainian defenders and Ukrainian resilience of Ukrainian citizens to push back against this invasion. However, I'm not a politician, but I think as a government official, you always have to prepare for the worst case scenarios, hoping for the best scenario. And the best scenario is, of course, for Ukraine to win, is to push back for the Russian invaders and take full control of its territory. That's why we're watching the front line. But also, any government has the duty to prepare for the worst case scenarios. And that's why we're working on all kinds of contingency scenarios. As I said, they are reflected in our national security strategies. And we are preparing and boosting our own defense capabilities, our own resilience against the hybrid attacks, which means we need to prepare for a very long, unclear situation on the front lines. And again, I wouldn't give much attention to the headlines, as again, media likes to amplify those Russia taking over a few villages on the Kharkov, which were very close to even to the first defense line of Ukrainians. I'm not worried about that. I think any war has its own logic. I'm not a military strategist, but you kind of get stuck after 2 years when both parties invest heavily in the defense line. So I don't have any expectations for a solution of the war in the forthcoming weeks, months, but it's going to have its own dynamic. I'm also watching carefully the Russian machine. I see, with the recent changes, they just done a fiscal reform these days about preparing its own population for a long war. Again, taking examples from Syria, it might be a long conflict that countries like Moldova have to prepare. At the same time, it should not distract us from the most important things, and this is uniting Europe. And Europe will never be complete. The peace project of Europe will never be complete without accession of Western Balkans, Moldova, Ukraine, and maybe some countries from Caucasus if they want. And I think this is what Putin really wants to prevent, and that would be the best way to respond to Putin, that Europe remains united, that it still has that transformation power, of building strong, resilient, sustainable democracies with rule of law, with strong elections, with citizens holding their governments to account. That would be the worst case scenario for Putin, to show to its own people very close to its border that these kind of societies can prosper and hopefully prosper much better to populations in authoritarian regimes.
Well, that's a very positive way to. Jim, did you have something there?
I was just going to say that's a very eloquent summation.
Okay, I agree 100%. Let's just hope that all that cash the Russians are setting in can be used to buy Moldavian wine to celebrate a victory for your president and your party, and may it also be the same case in the United States. We're not exactly clear running as well, so we got a busy fall, and I hope we'll be able to speak again after the election sometime.
Thank you, Florian, Frankie, Jim, for having this opportunity to talk again. Happy to reconnect anytime.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Have a good day.